Hello, welcome, and good evening perhaps for those in London and earlier in the day for those in Mexico. I'm Adrienne Arsht, Executive Vice Chair at the Atlantic Council, and I'm the founder of the Council's Adrienne Arsht Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center and the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center. Resilience has always been a passion of mine, and I'm excited today to hear from a panel of experts who have dedicated their time and their lives to the cause of elevating the need for adaptation and resilience in climate action. As someone who has spent years in Miami, I have seen climate and climate change up close and very personal. If you haven't lived through a hurricane, you have a minor experience that you better find a way to at least get virtually, watch the news and see those reporters leaning against that wind and just think of what that means to trees, houses, and people. Clearly, the time for action is now. And as we are about to begin this discussion, I am especially pleased that the Mayor of Miami-Dade County, I believe it's the fourth largest county in America, Daniella Levine Cava, has joined us. Before we hear from the panel of experts, I'll turn this over to the Resilience Center's director, Kathy Buffman-McLeod, and she will introduce the guests. Kathy?
Thank you so much, Adrienne. Thank you for your support, for your inspiration, for founding our center, and for all you do for us every day. I also want to thank the Rockefeller Foundation for their support of our work. Our session today is part of the Global Energy Center, a partner center of ours at the Atlantic Council, a series to support the Biden administration's Climate Summit in honor of Earth Day. We're pleased at our Resilience Center to be supporting the Race to Resilience, a campaign of the United Nations Climate Convention's efforts to engage and catalyze organizations and companies around the world through key initiatives focused on climate adaptation to build resilience for 4 billion people by 2030. We are extremely excited to have comments today from Nigel Topping, a high-level climate champion of the United Kingdom for the UK COP26. He was unable to join us in person today, but we have the esteemed pleasure of having his pre-recorded message for us. And Jackson, would you please play Nigel's video for us? Thank you so much.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone joining us for this discussion. My name is Nigel Topping and I am the high-level climate action champion for COP26 in Glasgow this November. And along with my good friend Gonzalo Munoz, who's the high-level champion for Chile for COP25, we lead the global Race to Zero and Race to Resilience campaigns. I'm really delighted to be speaking to you all today at this event being hosted by the Atlantic Council's Adrienne Arsht Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center, where we are going to be talking about the role of adaptation in building the resilience of the most at-risk communities across the world. But before I jump into what you can expect from this great panel, I want to share how the Race to Zero and the Race to Resilience campaigns are working together. Launched in June 2020, the Race to Zero campaign is all about rallying leadership and support from businesses, cities, regions, investors, and civil society for a healthy, resilient, zero carbon recovery that gets us to a zero carbon economy by the 2040s, that prevents future threats, creates decent jobs, and unlocks inclusive, sustainable growth. But we know that it's not enough to look at climate mitigation alone. It's not enough just to get to zero carbon economy. We also have to have climate adaptation and resilience on an equal footing globally. That's why we have the two campaigns, Race to Zero and Race to Resilience, both of which are needed to succeed to help deliver a 1.5 degree resilient world for all. Now, the Race to Resilience we launched only in January this year, and it's aims to catalyse actors outside of national governments. So again, really private sector, local authorities and civil society, with a bold ambition, but the necessary one, of building resilience for 4 billion people from vulnerable communities and groups by 2030. And we're going to achieve that by aligning the targets of existing non-state actor initiatives to this goal, while simultaneously working to create opportunities for sharing knowledge on innovations and best practices, and increasing collaboration and investment towards achieving the campaign's overall goal. We want the race to resilience to deliver a shift in thinking and practices needed to serve those communities most vulnerable to climate shocks. And I'd have to say those communities are often the most resourceful, but they need an act of solidarity from the whole world to ensure that they can thrive and not just survive in the face of the climate change that is already locked in and we know is going to get worse. The first 21 initiatives, which we welcomed in and announced under the campaign on March the 30th, are all driving a step change in global ambition and action on resilience. And in the lead up to COP26 at the end of this year, these initiatives will be sharing best practices, developing consistent progress metrics, and collectively mass mobilizing actors dedicated to protecting people and nature in the face of the climate crisis. We're setting robust, meaningful targets, which means hard numbers and firm dates to achieve our goals under both of these campaigns. But we all know that time is running out, and we're going to hear more and worse news from the scientific community later this year. So this is the time for action. Action that will raise ambitions for all of us to address mitigation and adaptation challenges together, and that will accelerate the actions necessary to make those ambitions come true. So we have the opportunity and the duty to address these vulnerabilities so we can be better prepared for future shocks. And on that note, I want to turn your attention to the Power Pact panel discussion that we have here for you today. I'm excited to see the discussion being hosted by the Adrienne Arsht Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center, because they lead one of those key initiatives that's just been announced as part of the Race to Resilience campaign, the Extreme Heat Resilience Alliance. And now today, this panel is going to be discussing ways in which individuals, organizations and governments need to come together in what we call radical collaboration to implement the interventions on the ground to build resilience. They'll be discussing the opportunities that already exist and how we can mobilize financing to scale interventions across countries. And not only is the panel going to talk about action on resilience, but action that will in particular focus on empowering women to build the resilience of communities, because we have very clear evidence that shows that women disproportionately suffer due to changing climate, disproportionately at risk than men. And it's really important that we're working with and working towards protecting women and minorities in our collective efforts. One final comment before I close. I'd like to congratulate Jorge Gastelumundi, the co-lead for the Race to Resilience campaign and the Global Policy Director for the Resilience Center, for very entrepreneurially taking on the massive effort of getting this campaign, the Race to Resilience campaign, off the ground and successfully raising the ambition around resilience and getting us going. I'm really excited to be, and honored to be working with Jorge and looking forward to what we can achieve together. So thank you all for joining, and I encourage you to engage with us through the campaigns, as we need each and every one of you to be working together to protect our people, our nature, and our world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nigel. Thank you for taking the time to record that for us, and for the kind words, and for my colleague Jorge Gastelumundi, congratulations. So let us kick off and have this conversation in the midst of the focus on climate mitigation and our efforts as a globe, as leaders, as communities everywhere, to reduce the emissions that are causing this crisis, or these crises, I would say. We have seen, as of yesterday, the International Energy Agency released a sobering report And it says that global CO2 emissions from energy are seen rising nearly 5% this year, suggesting the economic rebound from COVID-19 could be anything but sustainable for the climate. The IEA's Global Energy Review 2021 predicts carbon dioxide emissions would raise to 33 billion tons this year, up 1.5 billion tons from 2020 levels, in the largest single increase in more than a decade. This is a dire warning that the economic recovery from the COVID crisis is currently anything but sustainable for our climate, said the IEA Executive Director Fatih Birol. And I would substitute the word climate in Birol's quote to, for us, our planet and our habitat. What do? We adapt, we move back, we make changes, we shore up, we teach each other new things, we invest in things that withstand and provide protection, expand things that both mitigate and adapt for climate change. We need to focus on the people and economies who have done the least to contribute to the problem, but suffer the most. And while we have hope, that's a feature of the idea of the race to zero and the race to resilience. We do have hope. We also have plans, we have targets, but we also have to face reality. And the reality says we are nowhere near where we need to be on emissions. And that points very clearly to what Nigel Topping just said, and that is we must hand in hand, 50-50, equally push for adaptation and mitigation at the same time. And this panel is about climate action parity. And we do have a power-packed panel to discuss our plans, examples of adaptation, of leadership, but on the ground successes of what resilience looks like. And as the leader of a center, myself, for the Adrienne R. Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center, looking at our goal of reaching 1 billion people with resilient solutions by 2030, those are things that are focused on individuals, on communities, on big lever macro solutions. What has evidence base? How do we deploy capital into cities where the impacts of climate change and inequality and the economic outfall of COVID all come together? Migration, people pushed out of their homes end up in these cities. It's hot. I mean, we have a lot of things to solve. And so this panel is going to share perspectives from different perspectives. So our panel today includes Mayor Daniella Levine Cava, the new-ish mayor of Miami-Dade County. We have Isabel Studer, the director of the Alianza, University of California, Mexico, and Ekoswehi Iyahen, the Secretary General of the Insurance Development Forum. And both Isabel and Ekoswehi are senior fellows with the Atlantic Council's Resilience Center, and we're very pleased for that. So let me first go, each panelist will speak for about 2 minutes to make some opening remarks, and then we'll get into a conversation, and then we will take some questions from you all, and I hope you'll put your questions into the Q&A and we'll get to as many as we can. So let me turn the microphone over to Mayor Daniella Levine Cava, a climate leader and a friend to our center. Welcome, Mayor.
Thank you so very much, Kathy, for the wonderful welcome. Thank you, Adrienne, for your inspiring leadership. And I could not be more thrilled to be part of this exciting panel. Truly, I ran for mayor and was installed 5 months ago. So you say newish. Clearly, I am getting the hang of it, but I think I'm still new. But it was all about this topic. This was why I felt it was so critical to step up, because I did not see others taking this as seriously as I do and recognizing that it is truly the existential challenge of our times. So I'm very, very proud and humbled and sobered to be in this position with the weight of responsibility that is now on my head. Let me say, we are a community that is clearly on the edge of the challenge. We are considered #1 in the world for assets at risk. We've been identified for a long time as the canary in the coal mine of climate change and sea level rise. And I'm very, very proud that we have been very active in this arena now for some time, We do have our Chief Resilience Officer, and I lobbied to make that so. I lobbied to increase funding for that office, and we've released most recently a sea level rise strategy. And this very week, we're going to be releasing our climate action strategy with many bold agenda items. I've tasked our Office of Resilience to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2050, and our Office of Resilience to get us there at least by half by 2035. To achieve this, we've worked across the 34 cities in Miami-Dade County, and together we have a Resilience 305 strategy that everyone has adopted thanks to the Rockefeller investments, and we're so excited to now be partnering moving forward. So some of the examples for us in cutting carbon. We have 6 premium transit corridors under development so that we can have choice riders. We can leave our cars at home. We've cut diesel consumption by 44% by converting to compressed natural gas buses, and we are well on our way to making our fleet electric. At least half will be electric by 2030 of our county buses. Solar has been another passion of mine, and we've examined county facilities to see what can be converted to solar, and we have a goal of 30% of our energy in the county coming from solar by 2030. So buildings are the second largest contributor to the carbon footprint, and we have a very forward-looking Building Efficiency 305 program that I championed as well, that is already bringing on board some of the major buildings to identify ways that they can benchmark and then reduce their carbon production. And most recently, Port Miami, cruising capital of the world, may I add, we're coming back. We're coming back, has agreed to go to shore plug-in power. This will be the first such amenity of that sort in the southeastern United States. So I'm very proud of that accomplishment and looking forward to getting there. So these are a few of the initiatives we are, of course, learning together with the whole world during this critical week, this important week leading up to the Glasgow talks. And we're so grateful for the Biden administration's leadership and very, very hopeful that we'll be able to get to a clean energy and a carbon neutral future and do everything in our power to not only adapt, but continue to actively mitigate. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mayor. Look forward to getting into the conversation. Let me turn it over now to Isabel Studer from the Alianza University of California in Mexico. Isabel.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, it's such an honor to be here and share this panel with this wonderful female leaders. And I think I want to underscore that because increasingly I'm sharing panels when talking about climate or resilience or mitigation, whatever the agenda is, just broadly sustainability. We see women taking on this leadership. So I want to also commend Adrian, obviously Kathy, for their efforts to really squeeze in this adaptation agenda. It has not been really seen as a key agenda as much as when you talk about climate, it's mainly about energy and the energy transition. Obviously, we understand how important that is because 80% of those emissions that are responsible for the increase in the temperature come from the energy sector. However, I do believe, as Kathy was mentioning, that given that we are in a climate emergency, and I think we need to start really using this word more often. This is an emergency, and it's the impacts, as Nigel mentioned, especially for those populations that are more vulnerable to climate change, it's really huge. It's enormous. We are seeing the impacts of COVID-19, especially on those populations. The setbacks in the Sustainable Development Agenda goals, are not minor. Imagine what it would be if we see the full impacts of an increase in the temperature of more than 2 degrees Celsius. I'd like to refer to, the many opportunities that exist in terms of the intersection between the adaptation and the mitigation agenda. Mayor Daniella has already referred to some of those areas, when you look at cities, because we are becoming an urbanized world, we see many opportunities, for instance, in the building sector, simply, to talk about how to reduce, the impact of the use of air conditioning, and the use of nature-based solutions, as very clearly Kathy has promoted in the Island Heat agenda for cities. I think it's, you can see there the critical intersection, because obviously buildings, especially in the developed countries, but in many developing or emerging economies too, are a source of emissions. At the same time, we have the solutions already to adapt and reduce the impact, of emissions coming from buildings. I also would like to refer to another, topic that is dear to both Kathy and myself, and it is the fact that nature-based solutions, have been historically seen as part of the adaptation agenda. Solutions like the preservation or restoration of critical ecosystems, such as coral reefs or mangroves. These are critical ecosystems, especially for coastal populations, protect them from hurricanes or tropical storms. Also, increasingly integrating wetlands or peatlands or other natural reserves in great infrastructure projects that are, critical also in terms of ensuring water availability or preventing floods in urban centers. Those of us who have worked in the conservation area have always seen as these natural, based solutions as great opportunities for adaptation and resilience, especially of, many populations that, live off these important ecosystems. However, we have not really looked at the opportunities that, today present the fact that, scientific studies have shown that 30% of, the emissions reduction could be accomplished through nature-based solutions. And I think this linkage is very important, especially if we think about the fact that according to some studies, 80% of the sustainable development goals are really dependent on this nature-based solution. So there I see the intersection not only between adaptation and mitigation, but also, of the sustainable development goals that are so important to achieve, or address issues like fight against poverty or the fight against inequality. I just would like to end this brief introduction by saying that, in Latin America, well, I'm based here in Mexico now, but in Latin America, you have a region that is incredibly diverse. You have 7 of the 17 mega diverse countries. You have the second largest reef system in the world. And also this region holds half of the world's tropical forest. Obviously, these ecosystems are very important to a very high portion of the population in Latin America that depends on the services of those ecosystems for their livelihoods. So we can come back, in the discussions, hopefully, with some specific examples from the region, where you can see the intersection between the adaptation and the mitigation agenda. Thank you very much, Kathy.
Thank you, Isabel. Thank you. Great points all. Let me now turn us to Ekoswehi Iyahen, who is the Secretary General of the Insurance Development Forum based in London. Ekoswehi, thanks for staying up late for us tonight.
Thank you, Kathy. Absolutely fine. And I also just want to say a real sincere appreciation to Adrian, to you, the team at the Resilience Center, as well as the broader Atlantic Council community for the opportunity to have this conversation. And I don't take it lightly because I think that for many of the communities that are most vulnerable, we've not had the luxury of thinking about mitigation and adaptation as separate things. It just has to be a combination. So I just wanted to start off on that point. For me, practically, when I think about the topic and reflecting on the role of the insurance industry in particular, I think that the industry has been quite forthcoming and one of the early news bearers of the fact that we are on a sustainable track, and the fact that, a 4-degree world is simply uninsurable. And that has prompted, I think, a lot of the progress that we are seeing more recently in terms of insurers' engagement around the net zero initiatives. For example, earlier today, the launch of the Net Zero Insurers Underwriters Alliance. But importantly, I think that it has also catalyzed further activity and engagement by the industry to work with the public sector to really find more and better proactive ways of leveraging the risk management capabilities, capacities, technical skills, and competencies that exist within the industry to help to tackle this challenge of what do we mean when we talk about adaptation and resilience building. So from an IDF perspective, I think that there are two areas where I see such a rich opportunity for the industry, not only in terms of the role that it can play as relates to mitigation, but also in terms of resilience and adaptation. A simple point is in terms of risk information, right? How can we support those governments, those communities that are particularly vulnerable to better understand what are the risks that we are dealing with here when we talk about climate change and its different types of impacts? And this is important because it ultimately also translates into what are the investments that I need to be making as a government, as a community, as a business to become more resilient. There's a lot of work that needs to be done by the industry to improve the tools available to support that conversation and that transition that needs to occur. But it's an important contribution that I think that there's a lot that can be built on. The second area, which I think is particularly important in this conversation, is really around how do we start to develop innovative risk financing solutions. The risk modeling information is important, not only in terms of understanding the risk, but also informing risk reduction investments. But then there's also another part of this. Disasters are there already, right? Governments are trying to cope with the impact of if it's a flood, as Adrian had mentioned earlier, a tropical cyclone, etc. Right? And there is a need for, better financing instruments. And so this is an area where I think that the industry can do a lot more, has the capacity to do a lot more, but it requires better collaboration between the public sector and the private sector to drive the innovation in terms of the solutions that are needed. And so for me, the partnership that we have with the Adrian Arsht Rockefeller Resilience Center is actually quite an important one, and particularly the work that you're leading, Kathy, in terms of heat. Because again, this presents exactly the opportunity, the challenge, but yet opportunity that we are talking about, which is heat is a significant, threat for many people around the world, often referred to as a silent killer with debilitating impact in terms of governments, people, communities, etc. And so our efforts in terms of our collaboration with the Resilience Center is really to try to unpack what are we talking about when we talk about heat risk and its impact on people, businesses, communities, etc. And begin to also delve into what are the solutions that are actually needed. And so for me, having this conversation here today is extremely heartening, because when I compare it to several decades ago, when I would have conversations around adaptation with some of my broader colleagues and community, it wasn't necessarily the most exciting topic. So being able to have such robust conversations at this point is not only timely, it is urgent, and it is needed because of the communities that really need all of us to step up and do better. So thank you, Kathy, for this opportunity.
Thank you, Ekoswehi. Thank you very much. So I would like to jump into the questions. And I think when we have Mayor Levine Cava here, who has been in her community and knows Miami-Dade County like the back of her hand and has been a part of so many efforts, I want to ask a question about who climate impacts the most in Miami-Dade County, and how does it impact them, and where do they live? Just, if you could give us a flavor of those impacts and how they play out in your community.
Well, thank you, Kathy. We do have something here that is labeled climate gentrification that I want to highlight. I believe the term was coined here because we do have these high coastal areas that have typically been our low-income communities away from the coast. And so real estate, of course, is most valuable with ocean view. So the fact that we have these other areas where the workers lived that is now highly coveted was identified, and there was a pattern that was detected by stealthy climate advocates, if you will, and who went and looked at the pattern of purchasing of property and saw that huge tracts were being amassed by speculators. And now we've seen one example in a community called Little Haiti, as it sounds, an enclave where the Haitian community had established itself, that has turned into a mega development project. And there's very little handle on how to prevent pushing out the neighbors and as property values rise and so on. And so that is certainly a key impact. I could talk about some of the things that I've done and we need to do to protect that gentrification from displacing people from these unique cultural areas and, of course, the workforce generally. But also the resilience. So if you are better to do, then you obviously can afford your insurance. Insurance costs are going up. We still have federally subsidized flood insurance, but that will come to an end as it becomes clear that properties might be requesting might be making multiple claims. There'll be a point in time in which the self-insured who can afford it will be able to live here, and the rest will be kind of on their own. We see it with hurricanes, and Adrienne pointed it out in her introduction that not everybody is familiar as we are with hurricanes. We have learned a lot from that, and we know that the most vulnerable have to be relocated. They need special supports, not having backup generators, food distribution, and we've actually created a network of resilience hubs that provide, first of all, know their community, know the people at risk, pre-identify, and are able to rapidly deploy food and other protections. And we do have shelters for hurricanes to get you out of high-risk areas for flooding and wind and so on. But we're going to have to start developing these for heat because we do have, of course, a necessity for air conditioning in this climate, especially during the hurricane season, which is the hottest time of the year. And we're going to have to be forward-thinking to make sure that people are not exposed for lack of electricity or generators to the risks of heat that come from these various displacements. So I don't know, if that answers your question, who's most at risk, but as usual, it's the people with the least means. Oh, I did want to mention another thing. Those who can make their home, harden their homes, they can afford to do it, and many others cannot. And we have we have some weatherization dollars through federal assistance, but I'm pushing, and I will have in next year's budget, something called SELF. It's a program that provides for low, moderate income homeowners to harden their properties against flooding and hurricane damage and the like.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for that. And I want to, and it looks like just the way the session's going to flow, we'll have, we'll hit one key question with each of the panelists, and then we'll have a lightning round, and then we'll get to questions. There's a couple of good ones already that have come in from my colleague, Randy Bell. So Isabel, let me come to you. Speaking of interventions that are both mitigation and adaptation, the first thing that comes to mind for me is the nature-based solutions and forests and wetlands and such. And I think it's a great conversation, and we know they hold this promise, and we've seen numbers in the past that tell us that we are the potential of 30% of emissions could be mitigated or biosequestered by trees. But tell me from your view, particularly in Latin America, what is the potential and how do they go together? And I'd love to hear thoughts about, is that real? And I think it is, but it's about capital, it's about projects, it's about the last mile or the first mile, however you say it. So over to you, Isabel.
Thank you so much, Kathy. Well, I think it's challenging to see this connection because it's even challenging just to develop the adaptation projects as such.
Yeah.
Why? Because we are talking about, remote places. We're talking about, areas where you have that vulnerable, population, maybe, not precisely the ones that you would visit normally, the more touristic areas, but even those, you have marginal populations or communities around cities that are increasingly, becoming attractive for touristic purposes. But I think it's important, to know that, in Latin America, if you look at, with the exception of Mexico and Chile, the rest of the countries, their majority, I would say, 60 to 70% of their emissions come from the land sector, land use sector, which means that, it's just normal because it's such a rich region in terms of nature. They have a very rich nature capital. Unfortunately, although we have that richness, at the same time, we see the very accelerated degradation of those resources because of the expansion of the agricultural frontier, because of urbanization, because of, the need to just develop, right? So I think it's this presents a paradox, but it's also, you could see it as a big challenge, but also a huge opportunity because, when you look at adaptation in the past, we were looking at, well, yes, you have to adapt to this new reality, but we were not thinking about, like in the case of mitigation, the markets, carbon markets associated to, how you compensate emissions through reforestation, for instance, because those are like the clear avenues in terms of also using nature to compensate, for the emissions that you are producing in the energy or industry sector. And now carbon markets are becoming, predominant. But very few people see in adaptation those same opportunities as we're seeing now with the insurance industry, because for the very first time, we have already talked about this opportunities that the insurance sector is seeing in, not only, the ecosystems, specifically like in the case of the coral reef in Mexico, in Puerto Morelos. This is a very innovative instrument in order to preserve the coral reef, and all the ecosystem benefits in terms of, fishing, in terms of medicines, in terms of many other services. But especially, I think the industry saw the opportunity to actually see the value of the reef in terms of preserving the infrastructure, of coastal communities. And I think that is a critical recognition. We need the science to show that is not only the reefs, but also the mangroves, but also, the forest and also other services, that nature offers. And when we recognize the value, then you would have an impetus both of governments and the private sector and the community to actually invest in the preservation of those ecosystems. And I'm referring to this because, we will not have time to talk about the specific level of the coral reef in Mexico, but I want to point to the fact that only 3% of public money is invested in nature-based solutions. Mm-hmm. And the Das Gupta report, presented last year already documented, the enormous value that these ecosystems offer. And we are seeing in Latin America a lot of very innovative projects to mobilize the private and the public funding that is needed in order, to preserve this ecosystem. So to me, nature provides precisely that very natural intersection between the adaptation and the mitigation agenda, but also because I think we are seeing, many companies that now are looking at the value of nature, as an opportunity for advancing the sustainability agenda and addressing poverty issues, but as well as looking at opportunities to create that value that is needed to bring in the markets, and obviously with markets, you need government regulation, and you also need a lot of science, which is, one of the areas that I'd like to touch upon at some point, because I think the role of universities today is critical to create that science, those methodologies that the insurance company, that other sectors need in order to implement these kind of projects.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much. So let me go to Ekoswehi. I really have two, and you might be able to blend them, but you said something really powerful, and that is that the world at 4 degrees is not insurable. I think I just want to say that again, because if we follow what the IEA said yesterday, we will blow through, we're at 1, we might blow through 1.5 to 2. Uninsurable. Boy, that's a Mad Max landscape. That's hard to even really get our minds around. So I just want to repeat what you said. But my question is, you have worked and been a leader in the Caribbean Catastrophic Risk Insurance Facility at the CRIF. You have worked with the African risk capacity in Africa. You've seen the world of risk and climate impacts from really interesting perspectives in developing and middle-income countries. And I would love to hear your perspective on this challenge of mitigation and adaptation, a little bit more about that, if you don't mind. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy. Yes, you're right in terms of the challenge of mitigation and adaptation. At the beginning, I also said, for the most vulnerable, it's a luxury to think of only one. They've always both, right? Because ultimately you're dealing with a situation where you have to adapt to a situation that you are not responsible for. And how do you adapt that? How do you adapt in the context where you have no control in terms of the mitigation side of the equation, right? So for me, in terms of the experiences that I've seen, is just a groundswell in terms of the urgency in many of these communities, if it's in the Caribbean, it's Africa, Asia, for support, right? For action on mitigation, on adaptation, for support, right? And that support comes in a variety of ways. And I'm going to emphasize again the point that I made earlier, which is on the risk understanding and risk insight. This is so fundamental and so important, right? How do we support those countries in strengthening their own national capacities to actually harness risk information so that they make informed decisions at the and we cannot assume that these things exist. And so there is an opportunity there, I think, and it's something that the IDF as an entity is really actively working on with our partners to establish a fund, some mechanism where governments can actually tap into resources to begin to strengthen their own national risk management capabilities. But importantly is this other element of how then do we cope with a new reality? There's a huge amount of investment that is needed, right? When we talk about resilient infrastructure, when we consider this in the context of COVID and the debt crisis that many countries are faced with, then it means that as a global community, we have to, step back and really be more ambitious in terms of how we seek to support these governments. From an insurance perspective, again, looking at solutions, the experiences I had in the Caribbean and the experiences that I had in Africa, where these governments actually really being desperate in terms of trying to find resources that they could help them to finance response and recovery after an event. But the reality is that for many of these governments, when you do have these events, 95% of that funding comes after the event, and the money is basically just thrown at a situation. And so there is a need to actually think about how do we invest more in ex-ante measures. And this is important because this is the point where you can have those conversations with governments around what investments should you make to reduce the risk How can we leverage private finance, if it's insurance industry, to help us to structure our financing before an emergency occurs, right? So these are the things that within the IDF we are proactively working on. And we've also recognized that in many of these countries, insurance is not the norm, right? And so there is a need to actually engage with our public sector counterparts in government, with international organizations that are working on the ground, to begin to help to build greater understanding of this risk, to understand those markets. And again, I will harp on this point, to drive the innovation in products that are required, products that are tailored to those communities that are frontline. And we saw some of this innovation, for example, in the African risk capacity, where the insurance was proactively linked with the scale-up of existing social safety net programs, or to pre-finance or scale up response from international community. But importantly, there was a process that we walked through with those governments to try to understand, what do your response mechanisms actually look like? Do you really have the resources available? How can we begin to crowd in those resources so that you're not suddenly faced with a surprise at the end of the day? So for me, when I reflect on that point in terms of what we are seeing in many developing countries, I think it is an urgency, a request, a demand for developed countries to act on mitigation and send clear policy signals and intent as it relates to this agenda, but also the investment that's required in infrastructure and better financing for recovery, which is inevitably part of how we're going to have to deal with a much more volatile climate.
Thank you. That was really powerful. And we are in the Extreme Heat Resilience Alliance working with Ecoswahi and others in the Risk and Finance Working Group on forecast-based financial instruments that are both parametric insurance that put money in beforehand. And there are lots of examples of why that makes a big difference. And so there are lots of innovative concepts and some real proof points that we can do more. So I would like to do a quick lightning round. So I would like to ask everybody, and I'm going to go backwards the way we, starting with you, Ecoswahi. So what is holding us back from adaptation? In like 10 words, what's holding us back from where we need to be? What's the gap where we need to be to invest properly in adaptation?
I think a major gap in terms of investing in adaptation is partly to do with the uncertainty. What are we adapting to?
Right.
Right? If we don't have certainty in terms of, and it doesn't have to be absolute, but we need to send, again, referencing the point I made earlier, what are our ambitions when we talk about mitigation, right? And the different scenarios that we are faced with, right? And that will help to inform the investments that we need to make in adaptation. But I know you said 10 words, Kathy, but adaptation itself is quite complex, right? It is not something that you can easily wrap your head around, because it ultimately also involves governments, businesses, communities having to make difficult decisions and trade-offs, right? Yeah. Because it requires a reflection of, what does a resilient future look like? What does it look like? Who finances that? Who pays for it? How do we make this happen? And so I can understand, there is a little bit understandable the complexity around why people have been apprehensive about adaptation, but that should not stop us. That's the point that I want to make. It shouldn't.
Hear, 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 hear. Isabel, to you.
Yeah, I think it's the connection between adaptation and mitigation is a win-win. I mean, that's clear. But we need to raise awareness. We need to develop the science, because there is a lot of science behind these new instruments. Also see the connections between one and the other. We need incentives, especially for the private sector, and innovation from the private sector. I mean, this is critical because, as Ecoswahi very eloquently explained, public money is not there right now because of all the other challenges that we see. But government can have a critical role in terms of the policies and the regulations to create the incentives precisely to make the private sector participate. And I think that, from this perspective, there is a lot that the new Biden administration could do if they see, or if they saw, nature as an ally to see this intersection, because then, there will be progress also in many other fronts on the sustainable development agenda that is also critical, to fight poverty and inequality, another key priority for this administration. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Mayor Levine Cava.
Thank you, Kathy. Well, what a challenging question. And I'm sitting here thinking, I'm so glad I've gotten to know these two extraordinary ladies, because I'm going to need to draw upon both of them as we think about how we are going to cope with this incredible challenge. So let's connect. Let's go, ladies. Truly. So recently we conducted a survey of residents, the largest engagement exercise of this kind in Miami-Dade County history. 27,000 people answered our survey. We had 1.2 million answers. And a few of the very striking takeaways. One, everybody here understands that we have a climate crisis. It was very shocking, and I'm actually getting the chills just repeating it to you, because for so long, we've been struggling with just basic awareness. And in Miami-Dade, people have heard, they've seen sunny day flooding, recent hurricanes that have inundated the downtown financial district, commitments made to invest in engineering like pumps and, these walls, the discussions with the Army Corps of Engineers about erecting major barriers in the Bay, which we're pushing for natural solutions, just like Isabella has been talking about. So this is in the collective mindset, collective consciousness of our community, which is incredible. And this was a very representative sample of all ages, demographics, income levels, and so on. But that to be said, that doesn't mean that we have the public will to do what needs to be done. But in any communications campaign for social change, there's the early look at the vaccination rate as a similar phenomenon. The early adopters, the slower, they're going to watch everybody else, make sure they don't die, and then the total holdout. So, we are in that moment in which we're saying we're going to build public will to tackle this head on and to do it with hope, which is very challenging. I was once told that the test of leadership is being able to tell the truth and still create hope. And I do take that daily with me wherever I go on this topic. So we have to have an investment strategy. We've started, but we're interestingly, and you're all, you're dealing with foreign countries, so I'm not sure how this works in other countries, but there was a lot of resistance to talking about this as a man-made phenomenon. So we just talk about the results. The results are uncontroverted. Water levels going up, flooding from storms, extreme weather events. Those things are fact-based, and they affect people's property values and quality of life. So that creates some public will. So now at our state legislature, for example, everybody's united in converting our septic system to sewer because that's more resilient and doesn't pollute. And we saw a huge crisis of pollution in our bay, which is our economic driver, from runoff and problems from septic and fertilizer and other problems. So we're creating the will based on self-interest, immediate self-interest, rather than communitarian concerns, perhaps. And so we not only have to persuade the general public, but we have to tackle some of the monopolies. We have major interests that are holdouts, that are not as agile as they need to be in allowing us to move forward. And also developers, we've always been in South Florida, a place where you could make a quick buck. And we need to have the people that have that long-term perspective. How is that value going to be maintained over time? So, and as the public, we can do things with our public dollars that we're prohibited from forcing the private sector to do because of preemptions at the state level, because of property rights. So we have to look for market-driven solutions. And that has actually, of course, been one of our salvations when it comes to car emissions and things like that. So those are some of our challenges, and I'm very excited to work with this esteemed group to move forward in addressing them, our existential threat. And I am going to unfortunately have to drop off this incredibly important conversation, but I am so very, very grateful to have been part.
Thank you for joining us very much. And I will we'll have to suspend the Q&A, but I do want to note a question that came from my colleague Randy Bell, who runs the Global Energy Center, and that was, should we not be thinking about not parity per se, but what does it take to invest in getting us to stay under 1.5? You know, be that both adaptation and mitigation. Do we need to say 50-50? Should we not just say our goal is to stay below 1.5 and do what we need to do? And I thought that was really a great point. So thank you for that, Randy. We addressed the gaps in one of the questions that was in the Q&A, and then Randy also mentioned incentives. You know, where are the incentives for both mitigation and adaptation? And I think we'll want another panel on the financial sector, financial services, and the financial system that drives some of those incentives. And we've got to make externalities, internalities as a part of the value. And maybe we can have another conversation about that. Thank you all so very much for joining us for this conversation. What a powerhouse. It's not a coincidence. These were all women. It's just not. Just going to say female leadership is fabulous. And I really appreciate all of my co-panelists, and to the Energy Center for hosting this session and the series on raising ambitions. This will be available on YouTube and on the Atlantic Council website. And thank you to all who made this possible today. And again, Adrian, thank you for your inspiration and your support. Everybody have a great afternoon, and let's hope the President Biden's summit goes well tomorrow. We need that to go well. Thank you very much and have a great afternoon.
Thank you,
Thank
Kathy.
you. Thank you, Kathy.
Good afternoon.